Falbo is living in this world that is just enshrouded with conspiratorial thinking surrounding his ideas about dispensational prophecy and the end of the world.
You're listening to Good Faith Weekly. I'm Mitch Randall.
And I'm Missy Randall.
We're here each week exploring the intersection of faith and culture.
We find people who stand up, speak out, and step forward
for inclusion, freedom, and justice for all.
It's time for Good Faith Weekly.
Brought to you by Good Faith Media. Welcome to Good Faith Weekly. On this episode, Missy and I catch up, talk a little bit about our trip to New Orleans, and then later on in the pod, we sat down with author Keri Ladner. She's got a brand new book out entitled End Times Politics, and it stirs up a lot of emotion for us. So it's going to be a good pod, so stay tuned. Hello there, Missy.
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing well, and you?
I am good.
Well,
I am well. I'm great. How's that? Let's go with that. I'm great.
Okay. Well, we just got back from a little bit of R&R.
Sort of. We had a little bit of R&R, then
did.
Pivoted to the next spot we'll get to in a minute.
Exactly.
But yes. Yeah, we did.
Yeah, we were down in the Big Easy celebrating our anniversary.
Yeah, we talked about last week. We were heading to New Orleans for a little quick, long weekend getaway, which was super fun.
Super fun.
And I learned a couple of things.
Okay. Tell us about that.
One, there is no place chattier than an airplane full of people heading to New Orleans on a Thursday afternoon.
You're absolutely right. I mean, you could hear the conniving plans of debauchery occurring on
Absolutely.
the plane.
That was such a fun just to sit and watch and listen to this plane full of people.
They were so excited to get there.
Anticipation. And there's no place smellier than the airplane leaving New Orleans on Sunday afternoon.
There is a variety of aromas that can only smell like shame and bad choices.
And regret. I mean, we stepped on that airplane and I turned around and looked at you. My nose was just curled. I was like, oh, they need to turn the air on in here. You could smell the sweat of, yes, like you said, bad choices.
Bad choices and regret. You're absolutely right.
So yeah.
But we had a great time. We listened to some jazz music. We had a little Cajun food, and just maybe had a beignet or two.
Or 7. Yes, we did. The music was amazing. We found some great spots to listen and just had a great time walking around and enjoying the city. Took a tour, did all the touristy things. So it was fun.
It was fun, and it was nice to get away.
But I will say this.
Okay.
Just like parents who leave their children alone for an evening thinking, surely we can go out and they'll be fine.
I know where you're going with this.
We learned.
Yes, we did.
We cannot leave our state alone for a weekend without them doing something stupid.
I mean, you hope the best for your kids. You expect them to, make good choices while you're gone. And they just disappoint you.
So we, again, we'll get to the rest of the story in a moment, but we left New Orleans, flew to D.C.
Yes.
For, work-related things we'll talk about in a minute, and ran into a good friend of ours in the hotel lobby who said, hey, have you heard what your state senator, you know what, I'm not even going to say his name. I don't think he deserves it. Said in a public forum. We said, no, we've been unplugged for the weekend, and looked it up and found, again, we talked about last week, the unfortunate and tragic death of Nex Benedict in our state. And as much as I normally enjoy being right, are we right? Right?
Yes, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah, you enjoy it immensely.
I am sick to my stomach.
Yeah.
Because last week I think I said in the opening, I think I said it on the podcast, that the folks who are on the far right don't care that inclusion and acceptance and love is a life and death issue because they don't feel like certain lives are valuable or worthy. Mm-hmm. And our, dear little state senator confirmed what I said when he was in a public forum. Do you want to read the statement or do you want me to?
No, go ahead.
And he states, "We are a religious state, and we are going to fight it to keep that filth out of the state of Oklahoma because we are a Christian state." There you go.
Yeah, he said something out loud that has been said behind closed doors. And we've been talking about this here at Good Faith Weekly, Good Faith Media, and for decades within this movement fighting for equality and justice. And one of the things that I want to say about this, Missy, is that this type of rhetoric, this type of mentality, this type of hate was a reminder that in the height of the marches after the death and murder of George Floyd, when African American people took to the streets chanting Black Lives Matter, and it even happened before that at the death of Michael Brown. Mm-hmm. And the retort from conservative Christians was what?
All lives matter.
That was bull.
I mean,
because all lives do not matter to them. Period.
I mean, that's a great point. They came back with, "Oh, but all lives matter."
They don't to them.
And yet you just legit said on a hot mic that they don't.
No, they absolutely don't. They want to get that, and it's hard to even say, but to quote the senator, and I just can't believe he's a state senator at this point, keeping that filth out of Oklahoma. But this is not an isolated incident. I mean, there was a Republican state representative last year who was arguing for an anti-trans bill in the Florida state that talked about the eradication of LGBTQ people, that would be acceptable because it was so wrong in his eyes. I mean, a lot of people think when we talk about these things, when we write about these things at Good Faith Media, that we are, being
alarmist.
Alarmist. Yeah. We're using hyperbole in our descriptions. Maya Angelou said it best. When someone tells you who they are, believe them the first time. This is who these people are. And it is appalling. It is evil. And it is something that good and decent people, both progressive people and conservative people, understand to be evil. The only way that we can change this rhetoric and these actions is for good people, no matter their political affiliations, even no matter their religious convictions, good, decent, honest people who are out there standing up to this kind of hate and saying, "Oh, no, you don't. This is not who we are." The sad thing is, I'm really worried this might be who we are in the state of Oklahoma.
Yeah. I think you're right. I just think it's the general we. I mean, that's our state. Unfortunately, though, that's the thing. It's not just our state. We're seeing this in other states, too, that have these super majorities and this ridiculous ideology.
Mm-hmm. Because, and you actually even brought this to my attention a couple of days ago. I'd love for you to expand on this, is what we have seen in the death of Nex and now the rhetoric coming from the state senator and other rhetoric that we've already mentioned, and the fact that all lives don't matter to them. Our African-American brothers and sisters have been telling us this for decades.
Yeah, so in the wake of Nex's death and kind of I don't know that I want to say confusing, but just the information that would come out and then change, and then the coroner wasn't saying much, and it felt eerily like the death of an African-American person during the civil rights movement.
Right.
Where it's just it's just covered up. Nobody's ever really going to give you the real story. And in this day and age, with the information we have, with access to information that we have, it is, I mean, I am astounded at the secrecy that still seems to be there, happening, where I just, for the first time, I'm wondering, are we ever going to know the real story? Mm-hmm. And it just felt, I was not alive, pre-1975, but from what you've read, from what you've heard from folks, it's just, that's what it feels like it might have been like.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're exactly right. And when you said that a few days ago, it was like this big light bulb came out on my mind that said, yes, that's exactly what we have read in history books and what we have listened to from firsthand accounts from people who lived during Jim Crow and the Civil Rights Movement. And here's what is so discouraging and alarming about this story. Everybody was following the white supremacy script.
Maybe that's what I'm trying to vocalize.
That they feigned sympathy and talked about protection of every citizen. But in the end, this state senator said was probably at the heart of what every one of them were thinking.
Right.
Get this filth out of our state.
It's gross.
It is so gross. It is anti-Christian. It's a follower of Jesus. None of this has any semblance of spirituality or ethical standards. But not only is it anti-faith, it is anti-democracy. And that brings us to why we are recording this in Washington, D.C. tonight.
So, yes, we left New Orleans. We flew to D.C. for a conference that was convened by an organization that we partner with, Democracy Forward.
Yes.
Called Together for Democracy.
Mm-hmm. It's a great conference.
And they brought together several organizations who are doing the work on the ground.
Doing the front lines kind of work, yeah.
Trying to preserve our democracy. And it was such an inspiring few days, a daunting few days as you put people in a room who are doing work, which is so important because we need to be talking to one another. We need to be communicating about the work that's being done. On the last day, we got to hear from representative from Tennessee, Justin Jones, who was one of the Tennessee Three that got expelled. Was it a year ago? Was it last year?
Yeah, last year.
And then U.S. Representative Joaquin Castro from Texas, out of San Antonio.
Correct.
And they just told, again, of their experiences of serving in government and what they're going through, and really just shine the light on what's happening on the floor of our bodies that are governing and attempting to make legislation.
Two things really stood out to me listening to them speak. And first of all, about the conference itself. Remarkable organizations all across the country. It is easy to get discouraged when you hear hateful remarks by a state senator and hear everything else that's going on in our country. But it's also inspiring to see how organizations and individuals across this country are countering that narrative and fighting the good fight on Main Street USA across this country. And that's what was revealed to me the last 3 days here in our nation's capital. But in particular, these two speakers, Representative Jones from Tennessee, said a couple of things. One, as someone who has literally had a megaphone taken out of a microphone taken out of his hand, he said this: "You can take a microphone out of my hand, but I've got a megaphone in my pocket."
So it's funny how you and I have the same quotes. I have it in my phone. I have it different. I have it cut my mic and I will pick up my megaphone. Yeah. He told us last night. Yeah. And I just thought, man, Wow. So let that be a lesson to you, my co-host. You cut my mic again, I will pick up my megaphone.
But I mean, just the energy, and someone who has felt the sting of attempts to silence him and his colleagues. That every time that happens, while it's discouraging, it's also inspiring for him to keep going, to keep fighting, to keep battling, because democracy is so important.
And I will say this, as today we were having a Q&A session, and someone in the audience asked the representative, said, it's one thing to get people into office who are good and decent and have,
right.
The well-being of all Americans as their priority. How do we keep them there?
Yeah.
And I don't want to speak for him or for anyone in that situation, but I did get a sense of how difficult it is. It's one thing to get elected, but to walk into that place every day and know you're the minority party, you are going to get defeated. And I did sense a little bit of it's hard.
Because, I mean, one of the stories he retold, which we've heard before from him on national news, was one of the first things he was told when he entered into the House chamber as a first-term representative for his state was what? You don't belong here. And that was just, it hit my heart.
Yeah, and one of the young attorneys, younger than me, asked, just said, how do you even react to that as a human being when someone looks at you and says, you don't belong here? Mm-hmm. With the very obvious implication of you don't belong here because of the color of your skin.
Yeah.
And he was very honest and just, in that moment, you're just so dumbstruck by the comment that you're getting.
Yeah.
And to me, it's just, it's crazy that that's still where we are.
And that is why it's so inspirational to listen to people like Representative Jones, as well as U.S. Congressman Joaquin Castro. And Congressman Castro said something even as profound as Representative Jones when he was talking about the importance of democracy and that it is teetering right now because of authoritarianism and the influences, which I can't even believe I'm saying this, of fascism is what it is. He said, and I quote, "If Donald Trump wins the 2024 presidential election, the United States of America stands at the threshold of fascism." Let that sink in. Let that sink in for all of you who grew up revering the greatest generation. Our grandfathers and great-grandfathers who stormed Normandy, who fought in Europe because of fascism, who made the great sacrifice, thinking that they had ridden the world of fascism, only to discover it not only has reemerged, it's reemerged in our own country.
But I don't think we realize it. We're the frog in the hot water kind of situation.
You're right. You're absolutely right. Absolutely right. So, well, we have talked a lot today about some heavy subjects, and we're going to continue to do that because we have a great interview. And I'm going to give anybody who grew up in the 1980s especially a trigger warning, because our guest this week is Keri Ladner, author of End Time Politics, and she talks about the theology of the 80s that talked about Armageddon and all the things associated with end times, eschatology, and politics. And we had a great conversation with her, but brought up a lot of feelings for me.
It was funny. I'm not sure if you were excited. It was weird. You were excited because you felt very validated.
Yes.
But at the same time, it's terrifying.
Absolutely. So stay tuned. Missy and I sit down with Keri Ladner, author of End Time Politics.
This episode is brought to you by the Summit for Religious Freedom.
Christian nationalists, extremists, and their political allies are working overtime to impose their narrow religious beliefs on all of us.
Learn how to fight back at the Summit for Religious Freedom on April 13th to the 16th in Washington, D.C. We're organizing to defend LGBTQ+ rights, abortion, contraception, and reproductive rights, our public schools, our democracy, and the separation of church and state.
The Summit for Religious Freedom is the hub for this collective fight. TheSRF.org. That's THESRF.org. Has all the details. Use promo code GOODFAITH for 10% off registration.
Anyone can attend virtually, and current students can attend the summit virtually for free. Scholarships are also available.
SRF sold out last year, and tickets are going fast. Don't sleep on this. Visit thesrf.org today, and don't forget to use promo code GOODFAITH for 10% off registration.
The summit is hosted by Americans United for Separation of Church and State. Freedom without favor and equality without exception.
Welcome back to Good Faith Weekly. On this episode, we've got a very special guest with us all the way from North Texas. Dr. Keri Ladner received her PhD at the University of Edinburgh and has published in the Christian Century. She has just released a brand new book, End Times Politics, From Moral Majority to QAnon. Keri, welcome to Good Faith Weekly.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right, Keri, so Missy's got the first question, but I have to say this out of the chute. I have been so excited about this conversation. This book has been sitting on my shelf for a couple of weeks now. I dove into it. It is fabulous. But I have been trying to convince people for so long that the subject that you talk about in this book is real, because there's a lot of people who just don't believe it. So first of all, thank you for writing the book. And I am so excited about this conversation.
He's feeling very validated right now. So can we just all take a moment? It doesn't happen very often, does it?
It does not happen very often.
So, Keri, let's start by talking about what interested you in the religious right and end times politics, and why is this topic so vital for you?
So I was personally affected by some of the policies that emanated from the religious right, going back to when I was very young, because of cuts to children's services and assistance not being accessible to children who were at risk, foster care services being extremely limited, CPS not having the capacity to perform its functions, and as a result being placed in a facility that was unlicensed and regulated by a collection of churches. This was part of Governor George Bush's faith-based initiatives in Texas prior to his becoming president, where he had actually authorized churches to be operating residential child care facilities as well as drug rehab programs without being licensed by the state. And so there was no oversight provided to these programs. I was in one of these programs when I was 11. And what happened is that the children and adults who were part of these faith-based programs were actually experiencing high levels of abuse and neglect. And this went national when Governor Bush became President Bush and had his faith-based initiatives, where he basically took this model from Texas and made it nationwide.
Well, Keri, thank you so much for sharing your personal story, because, like I said in the beginning of this, that this type of theology and politics that permeates the religious right, especially in this country, is filtering down to all aspects of life. And so you do a great job capturing that within just really the first few chapters of your book.
So do you mind if you don't mind me asking a little bit more of a personal question? As a child, as you're going through this situation and you're in this care, or you're not receiving services, I mean, at 11, I wouldn't have been able to connect the dots of why this was trickling down and affecting my life that way. At what point did you realize that these policies and this theology, were directly affecting and impacting you and many others? Like, how did you connect those dots and decide, hey, I'm going to write about this. This needs to be exposed?
Well, it started when I was about 17. I got curious about this place called Victory Acres where I had lived, and I just started looking it up online to see if there was any information I could find. And I found an article about the Roloff homes, which were associated with Victory Acres, and that provided a lot of information about how they were connected to these faith-based initiatives of Governor Bush and how the faith-based initiatives actually were not renewed after they expired back in 2000 because there were so many allegations of abuse and neglect, but then they actually did go nationwide. And that just got me to start thinking and wondering. And because this was something that had actually happened to me, this was not abstract. This was not something that I could just put away. So then, as a graduate student, I started reading about Jerry Falwell and this movement that he had brought together. It was kind of a strange thing to be reading about from this academic perspective because this is the water that I had swam in growing up. So reading about how that water had been poisoned was really eye-opening. But again, I wasn't able to just ignore it or just say, oh, this is something interesting. I could write a paper about this because I had been personally affected by it in some life-changing ways.
Okay, so Keri, we're going to talk about Falwell. That's a great segue into our conversation about him and his theology and politics, how they are still affecting society even after his death. But let's get some terms down for our audience because you talk a lot about dispensationalism in the book and this concept that just permeates this entirety of this radical right theology that has made its way into the popular culture now. So I can remember, Keri, growing up as a kid, pulling out that old Schofield Bible, having no idea what the footnotes were teaching me in it. So really briefly, can you explain what dispensationalism is and the person who gave it popularity, John Nelson Darby?
So John Nelson Darby was an Anglo-Irish priest in the 1800s. This was at the time following the Napoleonic Wars. The Napoleonic Wars were a time of pretty intense upheaval throughout Europe and the British Isles, a time of a lot of uncertainty. And there was a surge of prophecy belief going on throughout Europe and the British Isles at this time. John Nelson Darby entered into this conversation around prophecy belief, and he injected some new ideas, particularly involving the rapture, which is the belief that Christians are going to spontaneously ascend into heaven before the wrath of God descends in what he called the tribulation. And central to the tribulation for Darby actually was the Pope, who he believed to be the Antichrist. These kinds of Protestant Catholic tensions were not entirely uncommon at the time. And he also was not the first Protestant to call the Pope the Antichrist. But this became central where this idea of the end times, a one world dictator, the rapture, and the fulfillment of prophecy about the wrath of God being poured out onto the world for rejecting Christ. So during the Civil War, during America's Civil War, about 1863, Darby traveled to the United States at a time of, again, immense upheaval. So this was forged in the upheaval of Europe around the Napoleonic Wars, and then it came to the United States at a time where families were literally fighting each other on the battlefield. So the way that it was received was pretty definitive in how people were ready to believe that the end times are at hand. Because when you're experiencing something like the Civil War, where brothers are killing brothers on the battlefield, it's pretty easy to believe that the end of the world actually is happening, or if it's not currently happening, it's going to happen very soon. So Darby came into contact with a pastor named James Hall Brooks. James Hall Brooks was one of the big popularizers of dispensationalism in the aftermath of the Civil War, and he mentored a Confederate veteran named Cyrus Ingerson Schofield. Schofield was the editor of the Schofield Bible, and this was published by Oxford University Press, was actually the best-selling book in the history of Oxford University Press, if that gives you any indication of just how popular it was. And the fact that it had Oxford as the publisher gave it a lot of validity among both academic circles, outside of dispensational circles, really among the general public, particularly in the United States. So what he did is he developed footnotes that went at the bottom of pages in the Bible. These were commentary on how to understand verses, such as the Ezekiel chapter about Gog and Magog, explaining that this is about an end times invasion of Russia. So these commentaries that he added at the bottom of pages were directly related to his understanding of dispensational prophecy. So he really popularized it in that way.
See, Keri, you were bringing, I mean, I should have given a trigger warning to this, because everything you're saying takes me right back to my childhood, especially in my youth group during the 1980s, and all of this prophecy being taught in those classes. I can remember going home as a young child, crying myself to sleep, thinking that the Bible has predicted the destruction, annihilation of the world. And so, I mean, it's just, you gave this historical analysis of it that I really appreciated, but really,
there are so many people who have told me that they were traumatized by how they were taught about the end times.
Yeah. Okay. So, Keri, connect the dots for us from this European theologian who developed this concept of dispensationalism to Lynchburg, Virginia, and this Baptist pastor named Jerry Falwell.
Okay, so Jerry Falwell was a dispensationalist. He attended an unaccredited Bible college, Baptist Bible College in Springfield, Missouri, taught dispensationalism. But at this time, dispensationalism didn't look the same way. It was a lot more academic. The focus was on Christian separatism from the world. The world is doomed for destruction. The world is under the judgment of God, and Christians needed to separate themselves as much as possible from these ungodly institutions. So Jerry Falwell changed this from a radical separation from the world to radical engagement with the world. And he did so because he believed that America's policies were aligned with the Antichrist, this movement that would become part of the tribulation that was under the wrath of God. He saw America itself as being a part of this global conspiracy that was heading towards the rise of the Antichrist. But on a much more personal level, he had been affected in his ministry by how the IRS was going to revoke the tax-exempt status of Liberty University and Liberty Christian School for refusing to admit a number of Black students that was proportionate to the local population, as well as there was an SEC scandal back in the early 1970s that many have pointed to as a turning point in his ministry, where he realized that actually, if he's going to save his own ministry, he has to turn around how the American government is operating.
Yeah.
What I heard in these footnotes of this interview is money shows up.
Well,
so if everybody
money
can
always
just
shows up.
in this transcript, that'll be the asterisk at the bottom.
Yeah.
Ding, ding, ding. Okay. Sorry. Okay. Do you want to hear more about
the goal of this book was
well,
not to follow the money, but that is definitely a worthy undertaking. And there's the new book, The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory, that took a closer look at the money that was involved in the rise of the religious right.
It's funny as we're sitting here and Mitch and I are both listening to you talk, like he mentioned, this is just the trigger warning effect. I'm trying not to giggle at everything because I'm just hearing things that I can remember being in youth group and just being boy crazy, but yet in the background, all of these things that you're talking about, all these teachings. And so you're putting the bigger piece of the puzzle, or the bigger puzzle, together for us. I really appreciate that. So before I'm a little afraid to step on, but are Are you ready to move on from Falwell, or do you want to camp out here for a
No,
minute?
I think we're ready to move on because, what Falwell does, as Keri indicates in the book, is that, well, yeah, we could follow the money. He also takes this idea of dispensationalism as well as what is going on culturally, especially in the South, and leverages that to create a real political juggernaut. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that centers around what Keri, indicates in the book is the 1950s civil rights movement and, of course, the Brown v. Board of Education.
Oh, that's a great segue into my question.
Oh, it's like we planned that.
So, Keri, you addressed a topic in the book, another one that Mitch has been harping on for years, is that much of what the religious right advocates for is directly related to the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education decision that ended segregation in public schools. So talk to us about how that decision laid the groundwork for other topics that the religious right promotes, such as abortion and family values.
Sure. So first off, the religious right did not begin to emerge as a movement until the late 1970s, early 1980s, pretty much around the election of Ronald Reagan. But the political activism that defined the political agenda of the religious right really comes down to the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education decision. Now, we could go back before that and analyze other historical points as being definitive. But this is where Falwell's activism begins. At this point, he's a young pastor in his early 20s, and he's actually working with segregationist groups in an attempt to keep Virginia's public schools segregated. And then when that failed, attempting to actually have Virginia's public schools shut down to avoid segregation or to avoid desegregation. Sure. We get out of this the family values idea because of a lot of the stereotypes and tropes that he and other people really culturally, systemically were attributed to African Americans, such as drug use, relying on welfare, having children out of wedlock so that they can get more welfare payments, the idea of the welfare queen, which Reagan really capitalized on in his presidential campaign. And this idea that actually we don't want this for our children. We want our children to grow up in wholesome Christian environments where they're not having to worry about drugs and they're not having to associate with bums who are refusing to work because they can receive welfare payments. And so where you see a lot of this rhetoric that Falwell issued around drug use and around welfare, these were actually code words for racism. And we know, we can look at today's opioid crisis and say, well, this is not unique to African Americans. A lot of people of all races, especially white people, have been dying of the opioid epidemic. But we have historically, and especially in this time period in the 1960s, 1970s, attributed that to the integration of African Americans into American society.
Very well said. Now, another topic that you address in the book, Keri, is the politics of Armageddon. And I mentioned a moment ago that as a young child, after Wednesday and Sunday night Bible study, I would come home and cry myself to sleep. This is the reason I would cry myself to sleep because of this idea.
These days, it's other reasons.
Yeah, that's another episode. Something a marriage counselor needs to deal with. But this was the topic. So, first of all, I want to talk about this issue domestically, the implications it has for us domestically, and then also later on with foreign policy. But let's first talk about the politics of Armageddon in direct correlation with what's going on here domestically. Even as a child, I could remember people of faith's fascination with guns and the stockpiling of guns and almost the worship of the Second Amendment to the Constitution. We are the most gun-crazed culture in the world. We have more guns than you can imagine because we believe that there is this darkness looming around every corner that wants to take our stuff, and therefore we have to defend ourselves. Do you think this politics of Armageddon, this militarization of faith, plays a direct correlation with what's going on with gun violence in our country today?
Well, if we back up a little bit, one thing that's essential to this end times prophecy, particularly as Falwell promoted it, but also as Tim LaHaye promoted it in the Left Behind series. And remember, the Left Behind series was immensely successful in popularizing dispensationalism for an audience that would have never even heard it. A lot of people, by the way, were traumatized by reading Left Behind or by watching the Left Behind movies. Well, an important component here is that there's going to be this mass persecution of Christians during the end times. And then one thing that happened that I was 11 years old when this happened, and so I definitely remember it differently than you do, is the 1999 shooting at Columbine High School.
Yes.
And the stories that circulated in the aftermath is that two of the girls who died there, Cassie Bernal and Rachel Scott, died as martyrs, that the gunman asked them if they believe in God before shooting them in the head. These stories circulated very rapidly. The Columbine shooting was on a Tuesday. By the next Sunday, it was in probably every single church in America. The story about Cassie Bernal, that story was disproven by the fall. And then the story of Rachel Scott, there was actually never any evidence that she had been asked about her faith in God ever.
Right.
Well, but before being shot, there was no evidence that she had been asked about her faith in God. But the stories had a very powerful effect among people who were expecting that there was going to be this end times persecution of Christians. And so then there is a growing belief that we need to arm ourselves. And you actually see this reflected in the Left Behind novels, where the Christians in the tribulation force are stockpiling weapons to protect themselves and even kill the people who would come after that. And there's even the Left Behind video game, which thankfully was not very successful. But in the Left Behind video game, it was actually acceptable to kill somebody to prevent if you can't convert them.
Oh my gosh.
Wow.
I'd heard about this, but did not know the details behind it.
I did not.
I'm just a loss for words.
I did not read the books, and obviously didn't know anything about the video game, but that's wow.
Wow.
New bit of information
Sorry,
for us.
Go on, Keri.
Well, I just don't think we can underestimate the effect of these martyrologies that emerged from the Columbine shooting in the development of evangelical gun culture in the 21st century.
Mm-hmm. I agree. So with that said, let's also talk about how this politics of Armageddon plays into our foreign policy. I can remember hearing historians and theologians talk as early as the 1990s, the influence that this type of theology and politics was having on our foreign policy. For example, the first time Benjamin Netanyahu became president or prime minister of Israel, when he would come to the United States on a state visit, before he would go to the White House, before he would go meet with members of Congress, he would go to Lynchburg and talk to Falwell. And it just demonstrated the connection between dispensationalism, especially the idea of premillennialism and the return of Israel, and that we have to support Israel at all cost. How does that play? Does that still play a major role in our foreign policy today? Because, I mean, Keri, you know as well as I know, the Middle East is once again in turmoil.
Yes. So I actually lived in the Middle East for 3.5 years. I lived in Amman, Jordan. So I've seen a lot of this firsthand. I've experienced some of the fear that comes from being in an area that is a powder keg. So the Battle of Armageddon is an interpretation of scripture that says that there's going to be this massive battle that's going to result in the deaths of like 400 million people. And it's going to happen in Israel. And this is where the blood is going to flow up to the horse's bridle for, 200 miles. This is a very grisly thing that is depicted. Right. But it's supposed to happen in Israel. And we're seeing this turmoil going on right now following the October 7th Hamas attack. And you could actually look at YouTube videos and media that's come out of groups like the Christian Broadcasting Network and see there is a surge of talking about Armageddon around October 7th. But also, we want to think about what this means in terms of nuclear policy. So, Ronald Reagan was a believer in Armageddon. He was a huge believer in Armageddon. And there was actually a lot of fear at the time in the 1980s that he was using his belief in Armageddon as a rationale for nuclear buildup. He had reversed America's position of détente and trying to invest more resources into things that just make the world a little bit more livable, like social programs, public schools, instead investing them into nuclear buildup. We've not seen a reversal of this. And I think that's what's really important is to say, well, maybe these ideas are not currently affecting or directly affecting, let's say, Biden's approach to the current war in Gaza, but we've not seen any retraction of the politics that emerged around Ronald Reagan and nuclear buildup because he believed in the Battle of Armageddon.
Yeah.
Okay, Keri, let's continue on our workbook. Another page of Connect the Dots.
Another trigger warning is what you're trying to say?
I'm just imagining, yes, Connect the Dots.
Well, how about we think about this more as coloring? Like you have a coloring book and you're connecting the dots. Okay. Like, don't worry about the trigger warning. Like, we're just going to go into our coloring books open.
I love that. We'll do that.
And so this last question, it's so funny for me because at the end of the book, you talk about the satanic panic. And whenever I hear about this, I am immediately in my driveway in 1983, 84, in my roller skates, skating around, worrying about the Satanist. I mean, it's such a core, like, visual.
Big problem in Irving, Texas back then, huh?
Yeah, actually, we were in San Antonio at the time. Okay. But anyways, yeah. So you talk about the satanic panic of the 80s and connect it to the Clinton scandals in the 90s and the rise of QAnon in 2016. Can you help talk about that a little bit? And then even maybe going into the Illuminati, how Trump talks about the deep state and, like I said, QAnon, kind of, let's color that sheet in a little bit.
Right. So the satanic panic is something that really did happen in America in the 1980s. And this is kind of astounding because it really does seem like the Salem witch trials, where this began in the 1970s, the McMartin preschool in Manhattan Beach, California, where there was this really weird accusation that the preschool teachers were molesting a 2-year-old boy, and this turned into accusations that the teachers were flying through the air and flushing the children down toilets and taking them into these underground chambers underneath the preschool and taking them to Mexico where they're being shot with rubber bullets and being raped. And like, this was just completely absurd. Okay. Like, this is literally the imagination of preschoolers that are being taken literally at face value by law enforcement. And there's absolutely no evidence that any of this is actually happening, even though the evidence should have been completely overwhelming. And the fear of what was happening, that there were Satanists in America's daycares teaching America's children and, assaulting them and taking them to satanic temples and sacrificing babies to Satan and forcing preschoolers to drink the blood of babies that have been sacrificed to Satan. This is just so absurd that it actually happened. Like, this was people literally went to prison over this.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
But there was no evidence that any of it was actually occurring. Last I heard is that there were people actually still in prison because of this. And so Falwell is living in this world that is just enshrouded with conspiratorial thinking surrounding his ideas about dispensational prophecy and the end of the world. And that's coloring his approach to these events, that Satanists are lurking in the woods. Now, there's no evidence that I could find that he was directly connected to the satanic panic, to any of these accusations. If anybody has that kind of evidence, I would love to see it. But it's more this environment of fear and conspiratorial thinking that he fed on. And this really grew in the Clinton administration. And one thing that's really funny is one of my favorite movies of all time is the 1993 movie Hocus Pocus.
Mm-hmm.
And it played so much on the zeitgeist of the Satanic Panic. I actually emailed one of the writers of the movie a couple of years ago and asked him if he got any of the ideas for it from the Satanic Panic. And he said, well, we were aware that this was kind of in the water,
Sure.
but that wasn't directly influencing us. But you see, there's these witches in the woods, first in Salem, Massachusetts. So they're drawing on the Salem witch trials, bringing it into the present day, because this is really what was happening, is the Salem witch trials all over again. And they're trying to kidnap children and kill them, and so that they can make this potion that'll make them young and beautiful again. And one day I was watching Hocus Pocus and thought, oh my gosh, this is QAnon. Like, if Hillary Clinton was one of those witches, that is the core of the QAnon conspiracy theory.
Right.
I'm going to have to go back and watch that movie now.
Yeah, exactly.
You actually see this developing not in the 2010s, but in the 1990s, where Falwell is spreading these conspiratorial beliefs about the Clintons, particularly around the Whitewater scandal and then the Monica Lewinsky scandal, where he actually had the core of QAnon that he was spreading in the late 1990s, this idea that there is this secret satanic cabal of pedophiles that is forming a shadow government, and you need to be afraid of them, and we need to find the truth. We need to uncover the truth, and we need to get these people out of power.
Wow. Well, Keri Ladner, you have been remarkable. The book is titled End Times Politics from Moral Majority to QAnon. And Keri, as somebody who grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in the shadow of Rhema Bible Institute and Oral Roberts University, this has just hit my heart in so many ways. I mean, I can remember attending church with Carmen, who wrote so many stories about the so many songs about the Satanic Panic and all of this. It just,
and about the rapture,
everything about it. So this book really spoke to me. It is a fantastic, very, very well-researched book, and I thank you for publishing it. And thanks for being a guest this week on Good Faith Weekly.
Well, thanks again for having me.
But before we let you go, Keri, we got one last question we need to ask you, and as always, Missy's going to ask it.
So, Keri, as you know, our tagline at Good Faith Media is "There's more to tell." So, in light of your work in our conversation today, what is your more to tell?
This is not historical evangelicalism. Evangelicals historically have been at the forefront of progressive social reform. They were at the front of the movement for abolition, for temperance, for working laws, for labor laws, child labor laws, minimum wage, and then even going into the civil rights movement. This is not who evangelicals are, and there is a way back.
That's a great way to end it.
Wow.
Thank you so much, Keri. Again, the book is End Times Politics from Moral Majority to QAnon. You need to go pick it up right now. Keri, thanks again.
Thank you.
Missy, this was so personal for me.
I mean, I think, like I said in the beginning, you've been so weirdly triggered, but also giddy about this book.
It was validating.
Yes, I think we mentioned that in the interview. But in thinking about my last question to Keri and putting myself back in 1983 and skating, I was a big roller skater. I mean, I was a pretty good roller skater. Still am today, if I might add. But
well, don't hurt yourself, patting yourself on the back.
That's right. I mean, but I was thinking about this in my 8-9-year-old self and skating around my neighborhood, worrying about the Satanists coming after me all the while. I'm doing this with no helmet on.
Oh my gosh.
I'm like, if that is not quintessentially 80s, I don't know what is. Like, we will ride our bikes all over the neighborhood unsupervised or skate skateboard,
There's a
all of this with no
Satanist around
helmet,
in every
but we are
bush.
worried about the Satanists that are lurking in our cul-de-sac.
Oh my God.
Can you say I'm a child of the Ronald Reagan era any other way?
That's right.
Sorry.
And then also, I mean, obviously I'm a little bit older than you. I can remember when the national seatbelt laws went into effect and how some of my family were so opposed to seatbelts and what they would do to protect you. But the Satanists, they were out there. Really.
Okay, so this is a completely different aside, but you and I differ on this issue, right?
Uh-huh.
Because my dad was an EMT when he was younger.
Right, yeah.
And so even in the day when nobody else was wearing seatbelts and nobody else had car
Sure,
seats,
absolutely.
we were always buckled in the seatbelt. We had car seats, the whole thing, to the point where my mother would buckle us in so tight, God rest her soul, we could not breathe. I'm not kidding you. And this is another funny story. Even if there were like 4 kids in the back seat where there were only 3 seatbelts, she had this whole weird configuration of, I don't know, like cats in the cradle situation with the seatbelts that she would do. So that we were all, it wasn't like you shared a seatbelt. Like she would loop one around one of you and crisscross it over another and all of this. Sorry, you just brought back a really vivid memory for me. And then we prayed the Satanist would. No,
Well, yeah,
I'm sorry.
yeah.
I'm sorry. My fear of all of that and the end times and the rapture really did not come from my parents. Honestly, I don't remember.
Yeah, it didn't come from my parents either.
I think it was all your
was all
teachers
church.
and like youth leaders and things like this.
It was
And-
all church driven. I mean, 100%.
Yeah. Anyways, but
So-
I want to, in light of our intro, we talked about being here in DC and talking about the state of our nation. Upcoming election and Christian nationalism and all of these topics that have been just in the forefront of our mind the last 2 days at this conference.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the book is literally called End Times Politics.
Right.
And one thing that you have been beating the drum about for years now is this ideology and this belief about end times politics and how we like to kind of roll our eyes at some things and some crazy folks and some crazy ideals. But
Right.
you have long said these people who buy into this truly believe in this as a religious fundamental idea.
Right.
So go. Ready? 3, 2, 1. On your mark, get set, go.
Yeah, I mean, we could have a lot of fun with all of the craziness of the 70s and 80s growing up in a lot of this nonsense, and I can could take you back to listening on loop Carmen's Witch's Invitation.
I could probably, you know what? If you got me started, I could probably still like recite all the lyrics. Hey, maybe we'll do that as a treat one time.
Yeah.
That'll be a bonus episode. You and me, like, what do you call it? Beatboxing?
Yeah,
Is that what you call
we
it?
could do that, yeah.
To Witch's Invitation.
So, I mean, when we think about it now in this stage of life and where we are theologically, it does seem a bit crazy. But the reality is that was laying the theological foundation for what we are experiencing today. And that is what is terrifying. And as you said, I've been saying for a long time that a lot of people out there listen to these sermons that talk about end times theology, that talk about the rapture, that talk about Armageddon, and talk about the conflicts that will bring about Armageddon. And they think it's crazy. They laugh it off, or they think that's just rhetoric that religious people are using to propagate, their faith or their coffers, whatever you want to say. But here's the reality. Many believe it. And what we're beginning to see is how that eschatology, that understanding of end times, is affecting the real world. And not only foreign policy of nation states, but also domestic policy within nation states. Mm-hmm. And that is what is so terrifying. So while we do laugh about it, while we find it humorous, and I think it's all in good nature. The scary part of all of this is that we may be laughing ourselves into some very serious turmoil.
Mm-hmm.
And that is what is terrifying. I can remember at the height of the pandemic, and the vaccine had just come out. And we had a very prominent epidemiologist call to talk to me about what was going on in their efforts to get everybody vaccinated in their state.
Mm-hmm.
And that epidemiologist asked me, "Hey, I got a question for you." And I was thinking, "Oh, all right, what kind of
She's
question?"
going to ask you about science
Yeah,
and like
you ask me about
how
science.
the immune
I'm
system
your guy,
works
right?
and vaccines and
I'm your guy. But she said, "Hey, what is this phrase we've been hearing about the mark of the beast?"
wow.
And it was like, "Oh,
You got a minute?
grab a drink and sit down. I got a story to tell you." So I walked her through that and talked about it, and she was really blown away that people would actually believe that the vaccine could possibly be putting some kind of microchip in them that would be unquote or quote unquote the mark of the beast that could bring about the end times. The same can be said about people's desire to get out of NATO or to withdraw from the United Nations, afraid of one world government. Or in Protestant circles, the entire anti-Catholic mantra of the Pope being the Antichrist.
That was my kind of upbringing era. That was the big,
Yeah.
I don't know, line of thinking.
Right. And so all of this plays into the socio-political ideology that is actually born from this very out there theological bent that Keri was talking about in her book. And that is what is really terrifying. I'll never forget hearing a theologian talk about their experience in the State Department growing up in the not growing up, but they were serving the country in the 1990s or early 2000s. The first time, I can't remember when specifically it was, the first time Benjamin Netanyahu, who's now the Prime Minister of Israel, the first time he was the Prime Minister of Israel, every time the Prime Minister of Israel would come to the United States, the first stop was not the White House. Mm-hmm. The first stop was not the U.S. Congress to talk with congressional leaders. The first stop was always in Lynchburg, Virginia, at Liberty University.
I think you mentioned that in the interview. Yeah.
And think about that for a second, that this global leader is reaching out and influencing this voice, Jerry Falwell, who has an audience of millions of people, trying to get Jerry to use his theological bent to propagate the domestic and foreign policy of the state of Israel.
Or was it vice versa? I don't know.
It could have been both, yeah.
Both and
Yeah,
situation.
both and, yeah, you're absolutely right. So as silly as a lot of this stuff sounds, and you and I laugh about it quite a bit, it's really serious and very terrifying.
It's very serious that that the absurd is no longer just absurd.
Yeah.
Like in one breath, you're saying someone from one of our elected officials is calling one of his own citizens of his state filth.
Right.
That's absurd. And then, which is terribly absurd. Then you have like the almost on the other end of the spectrum, comically absurd, about, the end times or the rapture and all these funny things we're kind of laughing about. But on some level, again, as absurd as it sounds, Americans, people across the globe, really have a responsibility to understand this on some level so that we can see what ideology is now infecting and or infused into our government, into our policies. And honestly, I mean, I would say that elected officials don't even fully understand.
Oh,
I
no.
don't fully understand it. But yet it is.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there are scholars way smarter than me. And as, Keri so incredibly researched and wrote this book. And as another good friend of the pod, Ann Nelson, has written books about this. I mean, again, we've provided you with numerous interviews and authors who have written about these things way more educationally than I have. And it's crazy to me that my 12-year-old self that was simply worried about accidentally playing a record backwards, God forbid that the devil try to speak to me through that. And now thinking, you know what? But our population needs to know this because that's how we got. I mean, in some ways, it's not a far reach, and it's not a very big, as we talked to Keri about, it's not a very big connect the dots situation here.
No, it's not. It really is this simple. And an illustration that I've used in some conversations that I've had over the last 30 years of my career. And it's this analogy. Let's say you are 10 years old. Mm-hmm. And I tell you that there is a day in the future that I am going to take you to Disney World, the happiest place on earth. Mm-hmm. And you're going to get the most incredible experience of your entire life. Mm-hmm. But everybody on your block is working against you to make that happen. And if you let them, you're not going to get to go to Disney World. What are you willing to believe and do in order to make that trip happen?
Okay, so you're 100% right in what you're saying, and you've also ruined Disney World for me. So thanks for that.
I apologize, but to me, that is obviously every analogy falls short. But
I mean, I think that's a great. I mean, from my perspective,
right.
Again, 10 years old, that's pretty much the way the gospel was presented.
Yeah, that everybody is trying, the world, quote unquote, the world is trying to prevent you from getting to Disney World. And
because you're supposed to be in the world, but not of the world.
But here's the secret. There's a secret formula for you to get there. And if you follow this secret formula, this secret pathway, then you can get there even faster. That is what's terrifying in our society today. There are people who not only believe in this eschatology and end times politics, they're doing everything they can to expedite that to occur. That is what scares all of us to death.
All right. On that uplifting note,
let's go back to Louisiana, listen to some jazz.
I mean, I just want to sit on Bourbon Street, just listen to me some jazz, and pretend this isn't all actually happening. But here we are. Yeah. So we'll be back again next week talking about it some more.
Exactly. So thank you so much for tuning in this week. Until next week, keep living good faith. You've been listening to Good Faith Weekly, hosted by Mitch and Missy Randall. This weekly podcast from Good Faith Media discusses matters of faith and culture.
Subscribe wherever you get your podcast and give us a like and a glowing review. We produce the podcast out of Norman, Oklahoma. Our music comes from Pond 5.
And we're supported by listeners like you. Learn more about us at goodfaithmedia.org.